which will handle our topics for today on the extensive discussion on EDR, XDR that we were into in the last call. So I'll turn it over to you, Dennis, if you'd like.
Yeah, I'm trying to make sure I get the right one. Hold on, let me close a redundant and wrong thing here and see if this actually shares the right slide.
I'm glad to see you're on your computer, not your telephone, like you were yesterday.
Amen.
Really hard to run a meeting from your phone.
Are you seeing the EDR
Yes.
slide?
Yes, we are. Yes, we are.
This is just the next installment and updates for the EDR schema extension sort of subject area, which is the sort of second track of what we've been looking at in the working group, just from an analytic perspective. I'll get to some context on where I think we are with respect to this and what that should mean for the next steps. I've highlighted in yellow the things I'd like to bring up as discussion points today. So the first is the intention of this line of effort is to focus on the longer term detection and response and what that means for schema extensions, for being able to connect EDR and XDR technology across products and of course across the life cycle of the analysis that comes from that. There's lots of reason to do that, not the least of which is the existing mandate to get EDR on all federal systems and in all parts of the federal supply chain to facilitate visibility for detection and response of especially supply chain attacks, which are coming in from the inside out, which are using very advanced techniques. It's one of the reasons EDR capability got called out in the executive order and is being looked at across the board in terms of international initiatives in response to supply chain attacks, getting visibility, earlier awareness, and actionable context as a response. Going through this, the stuff highlighted in yellow was the stuff that essentially has changed from last time, and I'd like to use it to help refine things and get the sense of a group on certain things. So just in deciding the scope of the working part of the effort of this second track, the non-posture focused set of the part of the track, the distinction that we have in what we're focusing on in EDR seems to be more on the detection and response side and less on the curated forensics side. That is the place at which the forensics are used for evidence preservation, for argumentation about prosecution, that kind of stuff, guidance software, and in case, if you want a product anchor for that, and more focusing on what CrowdStrike and Komodo and all of the various other EDR types of tools focus on. So the first question for the group is that an adequate distinction, or do we want to bring in the more legally oriented evidence side of the fence and include in the ontology sort of embrasure that part of things. And I don't know that we've gotten at that point. I do know that most of what I've been digging into has been the detection and response sense of this problem. So anybody want to weigh in on where things fit with respect to the more evidence collection and curation and chain of custody kinds of issues, and what that means for the use cases and the ontology extension? Do we want to include that in this sort of part of the effort? And anybody interested in carrying the banner for that? Okay, think about it.
Hey, hold on, this is Forrest. Can you guys hear me yet?
We can now. Oh, you were talking now. Sorry.
Yep.
Go ahead,
I'm
Forrest.
sorry. I was driving and I joined late. But your question, and my answer to your question would be yes. And specifically, that was why we had planned to have the briefing by DC3, because that's where they're focusing. That's where they're focusing on that piece. The problem is that's just delayed. Owen just told me he can't make Thursday, so we need to push back to next week. But I would consider that we would, at a minimum, our work should account for the requirement to be seamlessly integrated with those pieces. So whether it necessarily goes into our ontology or not, our ontology should be structured such a way that you can show where the the forensic type of activities would link to it. Does that make sense?
It certainly does. The operational question is, do we have somebody on the call that would carry the banner for that would be able to sort of coordinate looking into the use cases and the accommodations in the ontology, at least as you suggest, the anchor points, so that we're not making it hard to include that stuff and embrace it. Does somebody
Right.
want to carry that part of the effort?
Well, I mean, I think it automatically falls into the project team. So I nominate Ian Ian for that.
Is Ian on?
So of course, Ian Featherstone, who's been supporting me, and
Sure,
and of
sure.
course he's not an expert. So I don't know if we actually have an expert in that field, and so until such time we're relying on expertise at DC3. But I don't know if with OCA, do we actually have like a company that gets into that forensic analysis stuff? I'm not sure about that.
The leader, I think, by far on that in the commercial sector anyway, is Guidance Software with Incase. Anybody else have any other nominated technology sort of center of mass for this stuff?
Yeah,
Well,
one of the things that they would do is they would look at the person with that skill set would look at the case ontology, look at the work we're doing, and help us figure out how to reconcile it. Because as we pointed out earlier, is that the case work was structured very much to support that forensic stuff, not necessarily all of the rest of cybersecurity. And so we should not assume that there's sufficient interoperability with the way that we want to structure our view of the entire architecture. Over.
Yeah, it makes complete sense. If we're not hearing any objections to including that scope of things, my suggestion on the distinction would be that the detection and response folks are really about live forensics, focused on facilitating response, and the more curated forensics folks are focused on evidentiary preservation and provenance and preserving the argumentation for prosecution and attribution, if that makes sense. But their focus is less on live forensics as it's involving, more on preservation of things that inform the decision of what to do, sometimes from a liability and a legal perspective, if that makes sense. Does that distinction resonate with folks? And we'll use that as a way to classify the two highest level sort of communities of interest we want to anchor in the ontology extension.
The first group should be focused on those things, because you never know where investigation is going to lead.
Sure.
Right? To terminating an employee, criminal activity, child pornography. That first group should be focused on preserving evidentiary chain of.
I think they want to do things that don't interfere with that or don't eliminate the trail, but they have the tools, the technology, and the people sort of job descriptions have a focus on that, sort of chase this down as fast as possible at all costs, right?
Understood.
They need a sensitivity to it for sure.
I am DAMO damage assessment #1 for DC3. So we used to send them one hell of a lot of hundreds of disk drives and forensics and memory.
Yeah.
And yes, so at the one hand, you're looking to get something to figure out what the heck's going on, to figure out how far it's gone. But anyway, I would say both should be there, and then the first one does not have to necessarily focus on those attributes, so those components of preservation or whatever. They should, but as long as the frameworks provide, a structure for that, I think it's good for everybody. Second point is Mandiant. So I'm a little dated in terms of operational hands-on, but Mandiant, we use Mandiant Mirror, what it was called back in the day,
Sure.
extensively for both system imaging as well as memory imaging. So that was another. So I don't know if there's still what their products are called. I believe we use them here at AT&T. So it's been rebranded, I think, but that's another player besides guidance. Over.
Yeah, for sure. That makes complete sense. I think all of the detection and response tools have a way of collecting the forensics and contributing them to repositories where the provenance can be preserved if you do the right kinds of tagging and timestamping and signing, and so that there is non-repudiation on the collected evidence. Yeah, figuring out the balance between these, how we make sure that the schema extensions then work for both kinds of usages, would be then in scope of this, and I'll make sure I try to adhere to that going forward. Any objections to that, by the way? None. All right. The second things, and this is just a refinement of the status from last time. I think that the implications for what we're looking into in the normalizations at least need to look at the normalization of identifiers and the normalization of behavior. And the two things are things that are complicated very heavily by the fragmentation in the tool space. We just look at the technologies that are used in detection and response. The way they've evolved, what makes them hard to integrate is that they use different identifiers for the assets at whatever level we want to discuss those. And then separately, very different representations of behavior. The introduction of things like the MITRE attack matrix has given us a normalized opportunity to look at the behaviors, the TTPs as they're expressed across tools. So different detection technologies, different detection telemetry sort of profiles, and across identifiers. The attack matrix, the attack framework doesn't give us the conventional way to think about, though, what are the identifiers that pull things together. So that's why I think we have to look at how do we specify such a thing that would normalize this and allow us to talk about the assets at different levels of abstraction, but of course also on different hosting environments. The TTPs can span clouds, they can span enterprises, they can span applications, and so there's not a simple sort of identifier in a convenient place to be able to say what are the interactions between this node, this asset in an environment and another one. Yet malware network behavior does go across nodes. And so there is a need to think about normalizing. I think at those two levels in particular, the uses of those two things are to facilitate flexible discovery, flexible registration of the things that you discover so that you know something about their context and have a place to hang that contextual information, the ways in which collection occurs, correlation, and analysis occur. The technology for doing that says that the architecture's probably got to be more flexible than just talk to some agent or talk to some asset individually. It's just the implications of the complexity that we're facing and the dynamics that we're facing in those environments. So I think those sort of characterize and refine what are we looking into technically? What is the so what of our effort in terms of what we want to produce? I think we want to produce a normalization of asset identification and a normalization of behavior with the intent of supporting discovery, registration, collection, correlation, and analysis. And if that makes sense as a first stab, I'll use that to constrain sort of the analysis and the results that we produce going forward. In the next item, and this is for your consideration around context, it's just highlighting what didn't work. In conventional asset tracking and correlation, we have a long history, decades, of paying attention to how do we combine IP addresses, MAC addresses, system SIDs, you get the picture, tuples of things, in order to try to get to unique and resilient identifiers for assets across normal change and across the normal life cycle and behavior of the things that we're tracking. And that moved across lots of things. I put 3 links into here. The first is to an IBM link around QRadar, getting at the same problem. How do you deal with dynamics of assets when you're looking at information that informs response? What does the merger of evolving things like IP addresses or multi-homed hosts or things that happen in response to, or identifiers that change in response to repair, like changing out a NIC? What are the practical considerations for correlation when that occurs? Separately, I picked on Greg Frescador over at VMware because he did a patent filing on a mechanism for dealing with this, leaning on cryptography. This just shows how far you can push this idea of having the right set of tuples and knowing how to invalidate them in order to try to preserve the idea that I'm talking about the same endpoint, even if I've swapped out a NIC, even if I've moved it in a virtual topology, that kind of thing. Just the considerations. And I think what it highlights is exactly the reason that the public clouds have moved to GUIDs as the identifier. The issues around picking the right set of tuples and the right ways to maintain consistency of those as the environment evolves and as the normal and increasing dynamics and distribution of modern apps has occurred, made it impossible to think about we're going to come up with the right set of tuples with the right set of weightings and the right kinds of correlations to solve this problem. Instead, universally the public clouds have leaned on GUIDs and used that as an anchor for all the other attributes that you might want to attach to it, so that you get sort of the ability to say across all dynamics, I know unambiguously what I'm talking about. It survives change. It's resilient to that. Separately, it gives you the ability to correlate to whatever other stuff you need, including those conventional identifiers, to be able to connect the dots with existing telemetry and tools and capabilities. But the authoritative identifier isn't those conventional combinations of IP address and MAC address and other stuff, because they're ephemeral, because they're mutable, because they aren't unique in terms of being able to map back to assets over time. So all I did was try to establish what didn't work as background for informing our discussion about what is it we're going to do as a result of this. When we get to the point where we have what are our expected deliverables out of this, I think we have enough to be able to begin specifying a sub-project. And that's what opens the door to potential collaborations with folks like MITRE or potentially NIST or somebody like that in the future. But until then, we don't really have triggered, as other folks have pointed out, the governance and the guardrails on the interactions with other folks. Does that make sense as just a line of reasoning about what the expectations are for what we should do next? Or any objections to that?
And while people are thinking about their comments or objections, I'll jump in again. Two things. One is you're putting a lot of pressure on my shoulders here. It's not a bad thing, but the other thing is that DC3 presented me or shared with me a paper that I will share further to the architecture working group. I guess I would just ask you for the time being, until given permission to share it further, that you kind of keep it, don't be, he's sharing it with OCA, so it would be at least with those companies that are members of OCA. I'm sure he appreciates that is who he's sharing it with, but I would just appreciate you don't broadcast it further very far from the group initially. But this paper that Owen and his team put together is really kind of a good articulation of the practical issues that were just described, with some good use cases there. How do where do we want to organize our information around, and how do we want to organize it? And pointing to the fact that the way that we've been doing it right now just does not work. And so they talk about sticks in there, and then they also talk about some of the challenges of using sticks. He didn't get into as many of the challenges as he explained to me on the phone in the paper, but I think it's a good starting point. So I will, when I get to the house, I will try to share that paper with everybody, because I think that'll really help solidify some of the discussions that were just presented here. Over.
Makes complete sense to me. I think that gets to the point of 5 that's listed on this slide, which is attack the right place to anchor or defend with respect to the responses? But it gets more to the point, is there another sort of normalization for how to connect the dots across these very, very different products in response to your suggestion of what doesn't work? But it's a perfect entree until the next slide as well, which says, I think, constraining to this group the interactions until we've decided what's the scope, what are our deliverables, what are the guardrails on the conversations and potential collaborations. Makes complete sense. I did meet with MITRE on at least the discussion of would there be an interest in collaborating on aspects of this stuff? And while they're interested, they're not ready. And we don't have the right set of folks identified. So I'm not going to pursue that until we're ready, probably until we have a sub-project defined and have invoked the right kinds of guardrails on that. So the collaboration won't extend to that point. Does that get to your concern?
Yeah, well, and that tracks with my experience with MITRE. So I kind of agree that we're not going to make much progress with them until we have something to show them that they can throw spears at,
Yeah.
really. Whether it's based on their product or not, they're just as much of a Byzantine large organization as the next one is. And so a lot of people say they do cyber stuff there, but it's hard to track anybody who's actually doing, besides like 2 people on each of those, attack and defend. And they have limited guardrails themselves. Over.
Yeah. And their marching orders are really around taking the things they've already done and getting maximum utility out of it. Sort of the primary goal of every FFRDC is to show to Congress that the money they're getting as set-asides are indeed being used for public good. That focus on leveraging what they've done limits how much they're paying attention to the strategic of what should they do next, and how should they sort of step past what they've already done. But at any rate,
that's actually kind of fun. That's accurate, but very funny. Go ahead. Or at least my experience. I would agree with that. Kind of sad, but funny. Okay, sorry.
The second is not collaboration, but was intended to begin collecting the perspective of the EDR and NDR or XDR, MDR, whatever DR you want to pick, collecting the perspective of the participants, either in the market or in the product space. I know how to move that forward in contacting, for instance, the folks that were either the inventors, innovators, and or product folks around particular NDR or EDR products. For instance, I can, in a heartbeat, get Chris Kugel, a principal behind Lastline, a really interesting kind of NDR capability, to talk about how they're facing this challenge of dealing with identifiers in increasingly modernized environments, and how are they dealing with behavior, especially mapping into things like the MITRE ATT&CK framework and the TTPs that are represented there. That would tell us something about the perspective of the folks who are building the tools that we want to integrate across. How are they looking at these things in their own words? And I don't think there's a big challenge to that. They're facing this as both a marketing challenge and a barrier to the next step of innovation, simplification, automation, if you will. But I don't know quite how to move this forward with respect to the open source NDR and EDR capabilities. One of the most widely used open source capabilities in EDR is, of course, Komodo. But right past that is Google Rapid Response, which attempts to do that at scale and answer the question in a cloud environment. How do you deal with memory dumps, and how do you deal with collection of forensics and all of the things that happen when the scale is unprecedented, when it's not being driven by individual investigators or individual analysts doing the hunting, if you will. And there are some upstart projects that are behind that. There are tools that are certainly relevant to detection and response that aren't sort of one-to-one comparable with that Gartner Magic Quadrant or with other commercial tools, aren't potential substitutes for things like EDR tools in commercial environments. But they are collections of stuff that have to be put together with people power. And so I didn't bring those into scope because, for instance, OSSEC fits right into that domain, provides very useful stuff, very relevant stuff, but I've got to cobble it together with a lot to be able to get to the point where I'm getting to a par equivalence of functionality with something like Komodo and something like GRR. One thing for the group to consider, if you have any insights or wisdom on that, is how do we pursue having an interview with the folks behind, for instance, Komodo, with respect to what's their perspective on normalization of identifiers and normalization of behaviors, especially regarding modernized environments, which are front and center of things like the regulatory drivers and a lot of the international initiatives. So think about if you have any recommendations on that. Any comments on that dichotomy. It seems easy to interview commercial EDR, NDR kinds of players. It seems harder to identify who are the guys quarterbacking the evolution of Komodo and GRR, given that they're in the open source environment. And if you have any suggestions, please don't hesitate to identify them.
Well, one suggestion, I think we have, isn't Cybereason part of OCA? They're an endpoint vendor, aren't they?
They are.
So why don't we talk to our near and dear friends in OCA?
Yeah, Sam Curry would be delighted to talk about perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would be helpful. That would be helpful. The other thing I was thinking of is, when you think about at least XDR, I think, it's more of a collaborative effort. Is there any thought or interest in defining how the collaboration needs to work? In other words, who's got information they want to share in the context of an XDR scenario, and how do they kind of get into the group to communicate about that particular problem? So we've got it's almost like a queue that everybody's interested in talking. Hey, we all want to talk a chat about this type of XDR scenario, and that's going to take elements from the network, elements from the endpoint, elements from a SOAR SIM, and they all can kind of join the conversation in an organized manner, so that when we do the collaboration, the data that's getting exchanged may be raw, but you know who to talk to.
You got a point there. We know what EDR is. We certainly know what NDR is. We know that by experience of the markets as they've evolved. XDR, however, is supposed to be the next step beyond those two, addressing their respective challenges. And the definition of XDR ranges from it's just NDR plus EDR, network perspective versus endpoint perspective, all the way across the board to, no, it's not really that. It's the fusion of the analytics across the union of their perspectives, which says I ought to be able to see behaviors I can't see from either perspective in isolation. Instead of just the correlation of those two, it's the fusion of those two, semantically. And then you get folks who just say, no, it's more about analytics, and all you need is endpoint instrumentation. This is the defensive definition of XDR that says I'm still relevant even though the market is moving. In all of those, I'm struggling with the market definitions promoted by sort of the marketing, the technical marketing specialists, versus distilling it down to, okay, what's the basics? And this is what I like about the MITRE sort of attack matrix. It says, okay, however you're seeing this stuff, this is the behavior the malware is exhibiting in terms of TTPs. However it projects itself onto either the network behavior or the compute behavior on the endpoint, or the behavior in terms of its referencing and dependency and interconnection and touching even the data that matters. In all of that, that seemed to clarify in perspective. But we have to ask the question, to be honest with ourselves on this, is attack the only way to represent it? Certainly Verus had ambitions of in the Verizon space of being that tabula rasa for connecting the dots across various forms of telemetry and tools in a portfolio. Are there others that were an operational organization of things like telemetry in order to be able to put the bigger picture together that we should be considering? I'm certainly familiar with Verus and familiar with the MITRE attack framework and how that's evolving, but not others. Anybody have any instincts on that as to what else we might be able to look at? Or specifically from an international perspective, I have less sort of immersion in that community.
I've only had experience on the product level, right? Different levels of product. McAfee did its way, Palo does its way, IBM does its way. But it just stimulates me as back to the OCA strategy. If we're trying to form collaboration, I'm trying to create a lingo of collaborations, maybe with this kind of what you're working on, to stop getting into the point by point. I'll tell you my perspective from Last Line or Cybereason or whoever, and kind of think about it in terms of facilitating the observance.
And I think in as much as, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Forrest.
Yeah, I was going to say, in as much as at least the U.S. federal government has now framed a lot of their requirements and stuff in the sense of using the MITRE attack framework, show how your capability can address the most amount of cyber threats, malicious activity, and things like that. So I think, there may be other the Diamond model and other stuff out there, but I think the most comprehensive and widely used representation or manifest, yeah, I guess, yeah, representation of the activities that are occurring is the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Now, and of course, I've looked at that, and I know that they have OWL files, JSON DL. They have stuff that's machine computable representation of that, but it should be a surprise to anybody. It's not really machine, I would call reasonable, understandable. There's still some jumps in logic in their work, but it's a good, I would say it's as good a starting point as any for the behaviors. Over.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Forrest. I think they've made some great strides there, and I do agree that it needs more work to round out the ability for us to relate multiple disparate approaches to a single.
So it sounds like
model.
leveraging it as opposed to just outright adopting it, recognizing that it may need enhancement or adaptation to meet our needs. That's it's a critical mass in that sense. But is it the only critical mass is I guess, a question we don't have much feedback on. So I'd ask that the group consider whether or not there's something else we ought to at least evaluate. And if there isn't, we can certainly concentrate here because it is a large critical mass. And don't have to have the answer now, but certainly that is a question I want to put on the table. Past that, those are the scope of things that I think we're working on. We're pruning this in terms of actively trying to foster collaboration with other standards groups. We're not going to do that until we're focused on what our scope is in more detail. The only reason for looking at the product folks in particular is to understand how they're grappling with exactly the same questions of identity and behavior normalization, just to make sure we're not creating an island that nobody wants to hug in terms of the integration of the tools that we're trying to get a unified perspective on in some sense. Note, this is track 2. It's the longer term sort of what do we do for extension to embrace EDR and XDR in general to its fuller functionality. So I'm not spending any time on the what do we do in the near term for cultivating the nearer term stuff like leveraging posture as a first step in connecting the dots across the EDR tools, a la PACE and that sort of thing. So but this is just not in the scope of the stuff that I'm spending time on in week-to-week stuff here. So, I think that's all I needed some feedback on, and I'll align this for focusing efforts going forward on this. But just keep in mind there's some questions. If you have an idea on how to pursue getting some feedback for the guys quarterbacking the open source efforts, really like to go there, especially with Google Rapid Response and Komodo, that together they seem to fit the largest deployment of XDR capabilities across open source offerings, but there are certainly others in smaller groups. And then independent of that, the normalization of behavior, looking at identifying any others that might have a critical mass. I wish I had more immersion in the international efforts and what ADISA is looking at in the NCSC at the UK, but I think that's it. Over to you, Russ.
Well, thanks again, Dennis, for leading us through that. Any other comments or thoughts on what Dennis just went through? Okay, I'll say there's a new. So I had one item I wanted to check with you guys on. I'm deliberating whether or not to do something. So I wanted to see if you guys had an opinion. I could find the right window. Where the heck is it? Here it is.
The blue tie, Rush. You should always go with the blue tie. It's a subconscious symbol of trust.
Is it? Thanks, Forrest. I should. So.
Oh, there was something else. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, no problem. Yeah. One thing I was looking at, some of you are involved in this, but we wrote the OCA architecture white paper about a year ago. It's obsolete. And I'm wondering whether or not if people have interest in working on and updating this. And if you remember right, the objective of that was to kind of say, OCA is a whole bunch of projects. What the heck are you guys doing? And why do these projects relate to each other? And what are you trying to get to? We really don't write that down very well. And the intention of this particular architecture, which is also posted in the GitHub, the old one anyway, was to kind of lay out things like this, right? What, we have certain, we're using stick shifter for this, and we're using ontology for that, and we're using what was called SCAP at one time for something else, and yada, yada. But the idea was to kind of bring together all the different OCA projects and lay them out. Where do they position in helping us achieve the OCA objectives of a collaboration and, an interoperation? And, a little bit of, high level blurb beyond, detailed GitHub ND files, but something lower than a marketing pitch on, what exactly are these projects all about and how are they helping you, get there. So, I always think that, to me, anytime I've been involved in these kind of groups, it's nice to have that paper, that really lays out what these projects are doing and why they're here and what the common theme is. And I was thinking about spending time on updating this because you can see it's obsolete. We no longer deal with OpenDXL, ontology. We're not dealing with SCAP anymore. It's PACE, yada, yada. We've added Kestrel since then. So do you guys find any value to this paper? I'm not sure after I built it and everything, we actually leveraged it at all. But to me, it was something I thought was interesting. But I wanted to get some feedback from you guys if anybody thought this was interesting, and B, if anybody was willing to work with me on updating it. So let me stop there.
Well, I can cover the A for you, sir. As my role is really the internal evangelist. So, for example, I discussed these efforts with our XOR team and our attack simulation team yesterday. So, I mean, I'm sitting as the central curator of threat intelligence. I touch all those 18 teams on the cyber side. So something like this, we're not ready to engage yet, and I don't think on the flip side the technology or the capabilities are ready for us to bring it all together. But I've already got approval to host a plug fest or whatever up in Middletown and AT&T to bring in. So I've got permission to bring that all together as a facilitator. But the point is, this is something like this that really, because they brought up the OpenDXL in our conversation. It's like, it was supposed to be open, but then it ended up being shifted to, so there was a bad taste in their mouth that I couldn't address. So a short version of this is something like this would be very valuable for me as the internal evangelist, number one, and number two, I can't pick up a shovel and help you dig the hole. So.
You can or you can't?
I cannot, sorry.
Okay. Okay.
I am already going to have to cut half of my standards committee participation as it is. Anyway, I can't. But I can be that evangelist facilitator. So I'm all about integration and plugging this stuff together and making it work.
Yeah, Patrick, I prefer the analogy as opposed to pick up the shovel and help dig the hole. I prefer the analogy: pick up the shovel and help construct the monument to awesomeness. Just something to consider.
I'm really good at saying, well, maybe a hole over there would be good.
But Russ, you bring up you bring up a good. So Patrick gave one important point of feedback, which is useful. That there's actually at least one person who's read it. But I think that's a good question for us to explore. And I don't know if Dee or someone can help us with. But do we have any metrics to show that how many people actually downloaded that? I know we can't actually track how many people actually read it, but can we track? I mean, was it actually used? Do we have any anecdotes besides what Pat just brought up of people actually using it and finding it useful outside the people who actually wrote it?
So to answer your first question, unfortunately, the old website had no statistics. It was a static website. So that's why we're moving to the new one someday. On the second anecdotal one, I did work with Dee, and a lot of times when I would help recruit companies for OCA, when we would call them and they'd ask the question, what the heck are you guys doing? We'd send them that document as at least an overview of here's the kinds of things we're working on. It's not finished, but here's kind of the product. So it did help us in terms of communicating to anybody outside OCA. And I would bet dollars to donuts if you asked a lot of people out there what OCA does, they couldn't answer you because we really don't have anything like this to look at. right? We send them to the GitHubs,
right.
right? Right. That's all we got. I mean, so we send them to the GitHubs. If you look at our website, and it really, that's too detailed, right? And Duncan said this multiple times. It's great I'm getting to GitHub MD files, but that's not really telling me, the project and its objectives and what their use cases are. It tells me how it works. That's great. It tells me what it does, and it gives me some asset. But so anecdotally, all I have for us is I know when I was working with DM Recruiting, we would send it out to people and say, here's a nice short white paper. It was only like 20 pages long, maybe less, on what we're doing over here, because some of these projects resonate to some groups and some don't, right? And that's okay. But the ones at least know what they were.
Russ, this is Xavier.
Yeah.
So I'm new here, and I'm just trying to digest you guys have been doing so far. But I can help you if you need any help, and I will probably also help me to better understand the all the different ramification projects going on right there. So you can count me in.
Okay, Xavier, thank you. Appreciate your help.
Yep.
So Russ, I was always thinking that monument that Forrest wants to build is actually Forrest's monument. That I was looking at ontology as being the breakdown of the architecture, and you want the highest level view of what some cybersecurity functions are, and then after you've got that view, you can plug in stick shifter into one little piece of the ontology. But it wouldn't be OCA project centric. It would cover the cybersecurity waterfront.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's two ways to look at it. One is how does stick shifter fit in a role in the actions that would be articulated through the ontology, and the other one is stick shifter using the construct, sticks morphing into being able to use the ontological concepts, which is one of the points of that paper that I'm going to send around to everybody. Over.
So given your comments, David, as you're looking at the ontology, as you said, Forrest is fixture here. You don't really see a need for this kind of an approach, then?
No, I do. You do want to highlight what OCA is doing and answer that question. I guess my complaint all along was, we had SOAR and SIEM in there. That's my perennial complaint, but we don't know what SOAR and SIEM actually do, broken down into their individual functions. And so,
True.
Yeah, so OCA is the new ontology actually is an OCA project.
So what you just said, sorry to interrupt, but I think I just had an epiphany. So maybe we should just focus on that, even because I think I may have made this point some time ago, is like the simple use case that's we've demonstrated and we've made a graphic about. There's so much stuff actually wrapped up inside of that the machine just can't understand when you just give them, that graphic. But when we create the ontology, we will often find that it'll explode way beyond that, and then makes people's head explode. So I think the sub case of the use case that maybe we should start focusing on is really breaking down the roles and actions of a SOAR and a SIEM and what actually goes on in there, and having an OCA kind of consolidated or consensus view of just those two components. I think that might be a good place for us to make a little bit more progress, even though struggling with the progress we're making, because we could do that independent of our concurrent search for existing structures and stuff for us to build from.
True.
I guess the short answer of what I've said there is you just gave me a really good idea. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's a very doable approach, Forrest. I think we could certainly do that. And I think we did take a stab at one of them, I think SIM, in the diagrams, but we didn't really go very far with it. So yeah, I think you're right. It's a very digestible thing, understandable thing to do. We actually have several SIM and SOAR vendors in OCI to help. So that shouldn't be too
right.
bad.
They've all got their opinions and views, and so then we can use this to show how we can kind of standardize that representation just of those two concepts. And that actually might be a very interesting might create a very interesting doable to say, here's from an OCA perspective, this is our ontological view of what the heck a SOAR is
Yeah.
and a SEAM is. That's
Yeah,
interesting. Okay, we can do that.
that would be,
We can do
I
that.
agree. That would be interesting. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, any other comments? Thanks for the input, guys. I guess it sounds like it's useful. I'll work with Xavier, and him and I can try and pull this together. This is so obsolete, Xavier. We may start from scratch just to make it easier. So,
Sounds good.
yeah, we'll see. Because in my mind, guys, I just think I think sticks is a fundamental. I think we now have LinkedIn OpenC2 as an element of building on top of. I'll look at what I'll look at what Pace is using as elements to build on, and I think, I'd like to, I'm trying to, one of my motivations is again to show from an OCA perspective, if I was to build a brand new security product and I wanted to do it in the most comprehensive way that allows for collaboration, what would you recommend I do?
Put it in a Faraday cage. Put it in
Right?
a Faraday cage and don't connect any power to it.
Well, that's the way it works
All
today,
right,
Patrick.
I do have a quick question on this document. Where does it? I see it exists in GitHub, but what are you using to track comments and all that?
We actually have a Google Docs link out there somewhere. Okay, so
if you could send me
when we post it again, when I re-version it, I will put it out in Google Docs because it makes it easier for you to do comments and changes and version controlling. Is that okay?
Great.
Yeah, I like using Google Docs for that. When you deal with
it took a year and a half, but I can access Google Docs from AT&T now.
All right. Trying to use an open approach. Yeah, Google Docs, not Microsoft Word. So we can do it that way.
Yeah, so Russ, you mentioned EDR as an example, and Vass is here. And OpenC2, we were writing an EDR profile, meaning a functional description. And then we decided to split it out into more than one piece. And so OpenC2 is command and control, and endpoint response is, response is command and control, but there's this whole other threat intelligence piece of it that would be a different set of functions. So this architecture or would call out differences like that.
Right, exactly. But again, it would also map nicely between the OCA project and the OpenC2 project. Right, and I think we're going to have a relationship between the PACE project and the OpenC2. So this document hopefully would capture that and show how we're blocking things together to provide the ability to collaborate a lot better than today's world where you just proprietary build your own and connect it to yourself. So that was one of the intentions of the document, is trying to lay that out. With a lot of space of, we really need help here because we don't have any connectors. We got a lot of cob jobbing going on in the industry and point-to-point communication. So I think there's a lot of that here also we could point out. But certainly there's elements of things that we're building. Again, Sticks is an example, OpenC2 is an example where we've got some elements now gaining a little bit of traction to allow us to build on, to put together things that allow us to better collaborate across these diverse solutions that we have today. And XDR and Zero Trust, even worse, beg for better collaboration than today. So I just find that the problem's it reminded me of network days when I went through it. And the problem's getting harder and more sophisticated, requiring even better interconnection. And yet the standards in the open group really doesn't have anything substantial there. They do have things, but I still think it needs to be more. So that's again the intent here, was to just foster that and show where there's places we could use more and places where we've started some building blocks that just need to evolve.
I think that highlights that recognizing that we don't have all the answers in terms of the evolution of, for instance, Zero Trust and the policy implementation mechanisms, much less the Zero Trust policy language itself, are evolving. Separately, the stuff around the underlying technologies, those are evolving, and then the things we're protecting, those are evolving. So just establishing that the document would be a point in time with an intention to adapt appropriately as things evolve seem a good perspective to build into the document, recognizing that we aren't at a finish line. We're probably not approaching one, with respect to.
Exactly. And the other thing Dee and I like to use is a help wanted sign on it. Help us here. Because when we do recruiting, a lot of companies will obviously say they have some great stuff, which are, oh, I believe that. And we're looking for them to share some of that great stuff to help us get to our end game.
Focus on cultivating collaboration. Absolutely.
That's kind of what, when we have the recruiting discussions, that's what we're trying to do. Yeah. Yeah. Because obviously that's what we're looking for. We're looking for more. Okay, with that, that's the only thing I had. Anybody else have anything else they want to bring up or they want to add to next time's agenda? I'll give you a chance to speak now. So not seeing any of that. If you feel free to email the group or send me an email if you have anything later that you want to bring up. But thanks again, Dennis, for leading the discussion and pulling us through that through the presentation on the next steps. And we'll meet again in a couple of weeks. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thanks.
Sounds
Have a
good.
great
Bye-bye.
day, guys. Thanks.
Good day.
Hey, Warren,
Yeah.
just real quick, just validating that these meetings at this time, Wednesdays at noon, they replaced all the other 5 o'clock meetings.
Yeah. Get rid of delete the Thursday 5 o'clock. They're all done.
Yeah, I'm
we're just
trying.
using this.
I'm trying.
Yeah. I'm sorry they come over as separate meetings in the calendar.
No, it's better than doing it through coffee. You know?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks.